So Sydney 2050 is a city vision that investigates how an increased height limit in central Sydney can allow for both sustainable population growth and public benefit. And it achieves this by linking the city's economic development and indeed its urban form to the public benefit of a sustainable transport network. It was commissioned by the Urban Task Force, who are a developer-funded lobby group, and 3 firms were commissioned to investigate how Sydney could accommodate future growth and specifically to question the city's statutory height limit. The results were published in this magazine. There were public seminars and debate, and the local media ran many stories based on the output. Now, in part, this study was precipitated by what can only really be described as extremely vocal reactions to high-rise urban renewal occurring at Barangaroo, which is a new financial district on the edge of the city. This development was approved by the state government, but vehemently opposed by the local city council. And it represents a step change in the scale of the city. Now, scale change such as this has always attracted public opposition. This quote could easily sum up the public's reaction to Barangaroo. We protest with all our strength, with all our indignation, to the erection of these useless and monstrous towers. Now, it is in fact a letter of objection published in Le Temps newspaper in 1886 by a group of Parisian artists against the partially erected Eiffel Tower. Now, ironically, 100 years later, the same words were used verbatim against the Centre Pompidou. And as we know, both structures are now much loved by Parisians. So when we started to look at Sydney 2050, we knew we were dealing with a step change in the skyline of Sydney and that it would attract public opposition. So one of the things we studied was views of the city through time. This is Sydney in 1934. It's a relatively low-rise city, but by the 1960s, high-rise buildings had begun to appear on the skyline. However, it would have been hard to imagine 45 years ago in this city that it would look as tall and as dense as it does today. And I'll do that for you again. So they're the exact same view. That's 45 years ago. That's the late 1960s. Australia Tower there, the circular one, is nearing completion, and that is Sydney today. So changing a city skyline is really like changing its identity. Cities' aspirations have long been represented by their skylines, and we thought we should consider skylines through history to guide our study. Cities with level skylines have been created by restrictions on their height, either through circumstance or regulation. For public safety reasons, New York in the 1800s had its height limited by the reach of a fireman's ladder. While in Paris, Haussmann and Napoleon defined the street wall and mansard height of new boulevards through that city for urban and aesthetic order. At the opposite end of the spectrum, there are cities of towers. In the Middle Ages, local merchants in San Gimignano built towers on that hill town's skyline as symbols of their power and wealth. While London's ecclesiastic communities in the 1700s were identified on the skyline by church spires, as was captivatingly portrayed in paintings by Canaletto. Of course, there are the archetypal modern tower cities of New York and Chicago, representing capitalism and the free market. But today, a new breed of city is defining itself on the global landscape through their skyline. The Asian tiger economies are declaring their ascendancy through the height of their skylines. Shanghai's Pudong was a rice paddy only 30 years ago. Now, Sydney, with its height capped at 235 metres, we believe needed to have 21st century aspirations for its skyline, particularly in our Southeast Asian region, where we're competing with Southeast Asian countries who are looking at towers of 600 metres. So let me give you some background on Sydney for those of you who haven't been there. Sydney is built around one of the world's great natural harbours. It has a geography of peninsulas that has made connectivity and public transport difficult. The central business district is high-rise, while it is surrounded by a low-density and very large metropolitan area. The City of Sydney has a statutory height limit of 235 metres, which is based on the underside of the habitable floors of the Centre Point Tower, which is a landmark observation tower. And you can see how buildings are rising just to the underside of that Centre Point Tower. Now, this tower is similar to towers developed at the same time in Auckland, Toronto and Seattle. And they were aspirational in the 1970s. Now, while Centre Point was, in the 1970s, the focus of the Sydney skyline, one can observe now, after 45 years of the statutory height limit, and I'm showing here the envelopes, the statutory maximum envelopes in Sydney, that it has encouraged a horizontal skyline in the city. Thus, in Sydney, we have a similar situation to Philadelphia's former self-imposed height limit that maintains the preeminence of William Penn's statue. However, in Sydney, it is defined by law. And we believe that if Sydney is to maintain its status as a global city, it must have aspirations beyond this 1970s landmark. But our challenge was how to reimagine Sydney's skyline rather than simply suggesting an increase in height right across the city. We worked from three principles. The first, that cities will grow. Second, that density is sustainable, and that rapid transport is sustainable urban transport. So cities grow. We all know they increase in population over time. The big question is where to place the additional development required to accommodate growth. We believe that it is simply not sustainable for our city to continue to grow by suburban sprawl. Density is sustainable. Studies have clearly demonstrated that higher densities reduce the transport energy per capita, as well as the energy consumed by buildings. And I'm sure you're familiar with these studies, so I won't go through them. Thus, we believe the sustainable place to explore additional density and height is in the CBD. And rapid transport is sustainable urban transport. Before we could suggest increased density in the CBD, we knew we had to tackle the issue of public transport. Sydney is one of the only global cities without a metro transport network. And this is a map of the metro transport networks for cities around the world. It does, however, have an extensive heavy rail network that services the outer suburbs. But it's literally a single line through the city. Infrastructure Australia has predicted that demand for public transport in terms of passenger kilometres travelled will rise an average of 89% across all Australian capital cities, and that in Sydney it will rise 55%. And Infrastructure New South Wales has said that additional capacity will be required on the core of the network as our public transport system is currently at capacity. So let me tell you about our vision for Sydney. We based our concept on three core ideas which we believe are vital for global cities to thrive in the 21st century, and they are sustainability, economic development and public amenity. So sustainability. To be sustainable with an increased density, we believe Sydney needs a fully functioning rapid transport system providing transport through the CBD and the inner ring suburbs. We proposed that the existing heavy rail network service the outer ring suburbs and then goes express to major transport nodes at either end of our city centre. where it is complemented by a rapid transit system that services the city centre and the inner ring suburbs. Our vision proposed the development of super tall buildings. I'm talking about buildings over 1,000 feet or 300 metres, within a 200-metre radius of rapid transit nodes within the city centre. This creates a city form and skyline that is directly linked to and celebrates its transport system. It also challenges the current horizontality of the city. And economic development. We've proposed that the provision of a sustainable public transport system will be directly linked to economic development in the CBD. Heritage floor space is currently traded for height in Sydney. In a similar manner, we propose increased floor space for super tall buildings, which is floor space above the current height limits, will be bought from the state government to pay for a rapid transport system. And so by linking transport and floor space to the morphology of the city, the morphology of the city starts to follow the transport network. In urban morphology terms, the city, as I've said, is tending towards a flat top at 235 metres, encouraged by the city's height limits. By relating height to transport, we've created a city form of hills and valleys. So showing there in blue is the additional development above transport stations. Interestingly, Centrepoint Tower maintains its presence on the skyline in a valley. Now we've estimated the value of economic development in the city above the current height limit. The total floor area above the height limit is 4.8 million square metres, or 48 million square feet, which will be sold as super tall floor space. Using the current value of heritage floor space as a benchmark and compounding its value over 35 years to 2050, we estimated this realises $7.1 billion for Sydney to fund a sustainable transport network. And public amenity. We recognise the amenity of cities is vital for well-being. However, protection of amenity should not prohibit economic development. Sunlight to public spaces is important, but needs to be balanced against economic development. The Centrepoint Tower was allowed to overshadow Hyde Park. In a similar vein, we are proposing a relaxation of the current prohibition of overshadowing by allowing a defined maximum of 1 hour of shadow for super tall buildings. This will influence the width of super tall buildings as well as their distance from parks. We have additional urban design controls that have influenced our vision. To ensure a varied skyline, we propose super tall buildings must be 35% taller than their current context. So it was literally asking for a step change in the scale of the city. And to reduce visual bulk, tall buildings must taper or set back as they rise. They must have a mix of uses and incorporate publicly accessible spaces. So we've put these ideas together and tested them in the Sydney CBD to get a vision of what the city might look like in 2050 if height limits were increased and super tall floor space was sold to raise money for Sydney's rapid transit system. Here is the city as it is today, and including North Sydney across the Harbour Bridge on your right. Now, if we apply the concepts discussed above, this is a vision of how our global city may look in 2050. I'll just go back and let you have that comparison again. Now, as a reminder, here is a comparison of views of the city in approximately 50-year increments. Sydney in the 1960s, Sydney as it is today, and how it may appear in 2050. And this is another comparative view of Sydney's CBD, before and after, with additional height built around transport nodes. Finally, we believe that even with super tall buildings, Sydney will maintain its romance and, importantly, its status as a global city for the 21st century.